Today we will start with a new chapter, Adaptations in Plants and Animals. You will see different types of animals and plants around you. You will see birds flying in the sky, monkeys jumping on trees, butterflies on flowers, fishes in water, camel in the desert. All these organisms live in their natural homes, which is called the habitat. So, the natural homes of organisms are known as habitat. The habitat provides an organism with food, shelter, and even climatic conditions which is best suited for them. So, what does the habitat provide the organism with? Food, shelter, and climatic conditions which is best suited for them. The habitat of a cactus plant and camel is a dry sandy desert. For an earthworm is the moist soil, for a frog it is pond or lake, and for an elephant it is a dense forest. And we see that these organisms living in a particular habitat, they have different types of features which is suitable for them for that particular habitat. Now, when I talk about habitat, habitat includes both living and non living components. So, the living components are called the biotic components, and the non living components are known as the abiotic components. For example, the habitat of a tiger must have both biotic components such as small plants to hunt and small animals to hunt and feed on. It should also have shady trees and shrubs where it can hide and wait for its prey. The habitat should also have abiotic components such as rainfall, temperature, oxygen, and so on. So, when I talk about habitat, I just don't talk about the living components, but I also talk about the non living components. The conditions in different habitats are different. Some places are very hot, some places are very cold, some places are very dry, and some places are very wet. So, organisms living in that habitat should have some special features in its body which helps it to survive in that particular habitat. And this is known as adaptation. So, the ability of an organism to change for better adjustment with the environment is called adaptation. Adaptation helps an organism to live successfully in its habitat. And if an organism fails to adapt or bring about that special features in its body or in its features, then that organism cannot survive in that particular habitat. So, adaptation includes changes in the body structure and behavior, which makes an organism better fitted to survive, grow, and reproduce successfully in a particular habitat. For example, cactus and camels are adapted to live in a desert. Lotus plants are adapted to live in water. Fishes are adapted to live in water. Birds are adapted to fly in air. So now let's discuss about the different adaptations in plants and animals. Today we will be discussing about adaptation in plants. Based on the amount of water available in the habitat, plants are divided into three categories. So, depending on the amount of water that is present in the particular habitat, we have three types of plants. Plants that live or grow in water are called hydrophytes. For example, Hydrilla lotus are hydrophytes. Plants that require a sufficient amount of water and live on land are called mesophytes. For example, trees, herbs, and shrubs are mesophytes. Plants that live or grow in a very dry and hot environment or plants that grow in the desert are called xerophytes. Example, cactus, babool plant are xerophytes. Discussing about the adaptations in hydrophytes, first we will discuss about the different types of hydrophytes. There are four types of hydrophytes. The first type is the free floating hydrophytes. These plants float freely on the surface of water. They are not attached to the soil. So these plants they float in water and the roots are not attached to the soil. They are called free floating hydrophytes. See in the picture. So those plants are known as free floating hydrophytes. They are floating on the water. Their roots are not even attached to the soil. The next type of hydrophytes are rooted hydrophytes with floating leaves. That means in this case, the roots are attached to the soil below the water, but the leaves are floating. Okay, for example, lotus. The common example is lotus. See the picture. So these plants are rooted hydrophytes with free floating leaves. Their roots are attached to the soil. The third type of hydrophytes are submerged floating hydrophytes. These hydrophytes are underwater, that means they are submerged under water, but they are floating. Their roots are not attached to the soil. So the first one was they were above the water and floating in water. Here in this one, they are underwater and they are floating. So they are submerged floating hydrophytes. See the picture? The next type of hydrophytes are rooted submerged hydrophytes. They are plants which are submerged underwater and their roots are attached to the soil. So look at the picture that is shown on the screen. So the plants are submerged underwater and the roots are attached to the soil. So the four types of hydrophytes are free floating hydrophytes. They freely float in water and their roots are not attached to the soil. The next one is rooted hydrophytes with free floating leaves. The roots are attached to the soil but the leaves float freely on water. The third type is submerged and floating hydrophytes. That means the plants are submerged underwater but they are floating. The roots are not attached to the soil. And the last one is submerged and rooted hydrophytes. These plants remain underwater and their roots are attached to the soil. So these are the four types of hydrophytes. So now let's discuss about the adaptations you find in these hydrophytes. The floating leaves of hydrophytes are very large and flat. The upper surface of these leaves have a waxy coating which makes them waterproof. We have studied in the chapter leaves that small pores are present on the leaves which are called stomata and they help in the exchange of gases. Now in the mesophytes or plants growing on the land, we find stomata growing on the lower surface, whereas in hydrophytes or in these floating leaves, you will find that the stomata is present on the upper surface. The stems of hydrophytes are very spongy and flexible. The leaves of submerged hydrophytes are covered by a sticky substance known as mucilage. This mucilage protects the plants from decaying. So, the leaves of the plants which are floating are large and they have a waxy coating, whereas the leaves of submerged hydrophytes they have a sticky covering on the leaves which protects it from decaying. Leaves of floating hydrophytes were very large, whereas leaves of submerged plants are very long, narrow, and ribbon shaped. This allows the water to pass through them easily. So, floating hydrophytes have leaves which are very large, whereas submerged hydrophytes have narrow ribbon like leaves so that the water can pass through them easily. All hydrophytes have a special type of star-shaped cells known as erenchyma. These erenchyma provides buoyancy. That means it helps the hydrophytes to float and it also provides flexibility. So hydrophytes with floating leaves have large leaves. These leaves have a waxy coating which makes it waterproof, and they have stomata on the upper surface. The stem of hydrophytes are spongy and flexible. Leaves of submerged hydrophytes are coated with a sticky substance known as mucilage, which prevents it from decaying. The leaves of submerged plants are long, narrow, and ribbon shaped so that water can pass through them easily. And all hydrophytes have a special tissue which is star shaped called erenchyma. It provides buoyancy and flexibility. Now we'll be discussing about the adaptation in mesophytes. I've already told you mesophytes are plants that require a sufficient amount of water to live on land. The adaptations that you will see in mesophytes are the leaves are broad but thin. Stomata is present on the lower surface of the plant and they are large in number. The mechanical tissue and the conducting tissues are well developed. The roots and stems are well developed. So all the plants that we see around us are mesophytes. Now we will be discussing about the adaptations in xerophytes. Xerophytes are plants that grow in the desert. In xerophytes, the most important adaptation is the leaves are reduced into spines. So the spines that you see in xerophytes are actually the leaves which has been changed into spines. Now why are the leaves reduced to spines? This prevents the loss of water. We know excess water is lost by the plant in the form of water vapor by the process of transpiration. So what happens is when these leaves are converted into spines, there is no loss or there is reduction in the loss of water. The stomata is also very less in number so that there is reduction in the loss of water. Next, the green thing that you see is actually the stem. So the stem becomes green and fleshy and it performs the function of the leaves. That means it performs the process of photosynthesis to prepare the food. Both the leaves and the stem have a thick waxy coating to prevent the loss of water. So if you see, all the adaptations that you see in xerophytes are to prevent the loss of water. Xerophytes have a well developed root system so that the roots can penetrate deep inside the soil in search of water. So the root system is well developed in xerophytes. Plants growing in mountains are mesophytes, but they show special type of adaptation to survive in the mountainous regions. So let's discuss about the adaptations in plants that grow in mountains. We live in the hills of Darjeeling, so this type of plant is very common everywhere. Plants that grow in the mountains are cone shaped. This shape of the tree helps rainwater and snow to slide off easily without causing any damage to the leaves. So the trees found in the mountainous areas are cone shaped so that the rainwater and snow can easily slide off without damaging the leaves. And we all know the leaves of the pine trees, they are needle like. They have needle like leaves to help the snow to slide off easily. And we know these type of trees or the pine trees are very tall. Trees in the mountains are very tall so that they can expose themselves to sunlight for photosynthesis. Okay, so they are very tall so that they can expose themselves to the sun so that photosynthesis can take place. Next is adaptation in epiphytes. What are epiphytes? Epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants. Epi means on top and phyte means plant. So plants that grow on other plants are known as epiphytes, and the most common example of an epiphyte is an orchid. Orchids are very common in the hills. You must have seen it. Now, how do these orchids obtain food and nourishment? Orchids or epiphytes obtain water and nutrients from the moisture in the air and from the surface of the host plant or from the plant that it is growing on. Now, orchids or epiphytes have thick waxy leaves. And one of the most important characteristic of epiphytes is the roots. They have aerial roots. The roots of epiphytes are found hanging or dangling from the plant. Okay, that's why they are also epiphytes are also known as aerial plants. It looks as if they're hanging or floating in the air. Okay, these roots help in absorbing moisture from the atmosphere. The roots are very spongy also. They are covered with a white covering, okay, to protect them. And these roots help in absorbing moisture from the air. Today we did what is adaptation, what is habitat, the three types of plants: hydrophytes, mesophytes, and xerophytes, the four types of hydrophytes, the adaptation you find in hydrophytes, mesophytes, xerophytes, and adaptation in plants growing in the mountains and adaptation in epiphytes. Thank you, everyone.